New Delhi and Washington finally seem to be closing in on the long-pending trade deal that could result in tariffs being lowered from the current 50% levels to about 15 to 16%. Now, this deal, as per the report, was set to be announced at the ASEAN Summit later this month between US President Donald Trump and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But new reports are now suggesting that Prime Minister Modi may be skipping the ASEAN Summit altogether. So this puts another question mark on at least the announcement of the trade deal, if not on the eventuality of the trade deal eventually getting synced. Now, with the way geopolitical equations have played out over the last few months, US now appears to be ready for a deal with India, especially driven by China's hardening stance. China's tighter control over rare earth exports and deepening US-China trade war are forcing Washington seemingly to build alternative supply chains, and that could be where India comes in. Of course, there is also this Russian oil angle, which we've already discussed on the show, but India is also considering increasing the quota for importing non-genetically modified maize from the US in response to rising domestic demand from poultry feed, dairy inputs, as well as ethanol industries. But the question is, with Bihar elections just around the corner, less than a few days from now, can the Indian side afford to make any concessions to go ahead and bring that trade deal back home? Barnik, can India make those concessions on agri, on dairy? Oil, of course, is a different story altogether. But with Bihar elections around the corner, can the dairy sector and the agri sector, any of those red lines, be compromised on?
No, so I think for the first time in the last couple of quarters, I think the negotiating leverage is completely with the Indian side. I think the desperation and the intent to close the trade deal rests far more with the Americans than the Indians, right? Even if you look at the reporting over the last 24 to 48 hours, the concessions which the Americans seem to be reasonably satisfied with are fairly minor, right? It's just moving around a few import quotas for non-GM maize, maybe for non-GM soybean, and maybe for some feedstock into ethanol. These are fairly minor concessions in the broader scheme of things. It's just a readjustment of the quota.
Okay.
We've not seen any news where the fundamental rate of tariff which applies to these imports is going to change.
All right.
It's just that the quotas will shift more in the favor of the US than other countries. That being said, I think it's a telling a sign that the Prime Minister has decided to skip ASEAN. That means that the Indian government is not ready to make a big announcement. Maybe there is political calculus around the Bihar election. There are also rumors that dairy remains unresolved as of now. There is a growing demand from the Americans that the Indian dairy sector, particularly the processed dairy sector, be opened up and tariffs be dropped for things like processed cheese coming from the US. I don't think the Indian side has agreed to that. So while the current shape and form of the rumors suggest that India will come back from the trade deal with a big smile, I don't think the timing is yet right to announce something with some of these things pending. So let's say fingers crossed before end of this calendar year, or worst case end of this fiscal year, this BTA may get announced. And even though if it gets announced, it will take another year or two for it to get finalized. So again, I'm not very hopeful of something announced next week, but let's see how it pans out.
All right, not hopeful for an announcement next week, but there could be another announcement next week. We'll come to that later. But Barnik, thank you so much for joining us and your input here to News 9.